When 10-year-old Cameron Price stumbled out of the smoke-filled doorway of his family's burning ranch house on the outskirts of Prescott, Arizona, on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-September, his lungs seared with heat and his face streaked with soot, the first person he saw was a stranger on a motorcycle who'd pulled over because something about the scene looked wrong. The boy didn't waste time with explanations or context. He just grabbed the leather-clad arm of the man climbing off his bike and gasped out 4 words that would turn a routine ride home into the most terrifying 90 seconds of both their lives. "My brother's still inside." Those 4 words were all it took for Marcus Stone Garrett, a 46-year-old construction foreman and member of the Desert Kings Motorcycle Club, to make a decision that defied every survival instinct and fire safety protocol he'd ever learned. He didn't wait for fire trucks that hadn't been called yet, because the family's phone service had been cut off 3 days earlier. He didn't hesitate or calculate odds or consider the very real possibility that he'd never walk back out of that inferno. He just looked at Cameron's desperate, pleading face, looked at the smoke billowing from the second-story windows, and ran straight toward the flames because somewhere inside was a child who needed someone to come get him, and sometimes being a decent human being meant risking everything on the faith that a terrified kid was telling you the truth. The Price family's home sat at the end of a gravel road about 8 miles outside Prescott, surrounded by ponderosa pines and the kind of high desert landscape that made Arizona beautiful and dangerously flammable. It was an older ranch-style house, built sometime in the 70s, with faded yellow siding and a wraparound porch that had seen better days. The nearest neighbor was half a mile down the road. Cell service was spotty at best. It was the kind of place where people moved when they wanted privacy and space, but that isolation came with risks when emergencies hit. Marcus Stone Garrett had been riding home from a job site in Flagstaff when he came around the bend on County Road 47 and saw the smoke. Not the distant kind that could be a campfire or a controlled burn, but thick black columns rising above the tree line with an urgency that meant something was very wrong. His first instinct was to keep riding and call it in when he got to better cell coverage, but something made him slow down instead. Maybe it was the construction worker in him who'd seen enough job site fires to recognize when a situation was going critical. Maybe it was the 20 years he'd spent in the Desert Kings, learning that when something looked wrong, you checked it out instead of assuming someone else would handle it. Whatever it was, he turned his Road King onto the gravel driveway and headed toward the source of the smoke. The house came into view, and Marcus felt his stomach drop. Flames were visible through the second-story windows on the left side, and smoke was pouring from the eaves. The fire had clearly been burning for a while, long enough to get a serious foothold in the structure. He killed his engine in the driveway and was pulling off his helmet when the front door burst open and a kid came stumbling out, coughing and gasping, his face smudged with ash. Marcus was off his bike and moving before his conscious mind caught up. The boy was maybe 10 years old, skinny and small for his age, wearing a Minecraft shirt and basketball shorts. His eyes were red and streaming tears. Whether from smoke or fear or both was impossible to tell. He saw Marcus and lurched toward him with the desperate focus of someone who'd been praying for help to appear. "My brother's still inside." The boy's voice was raw and broken. "He's upstairs in his room and I tried to get him. But there's too much smoke and I couldn't breathe, and the stairs are on fire, and you have to help him. Please, you have to help him." The words tumbled out in a breathless rush of terror, and Marcus felt time compress into a single crystalline moment of decision. He looked at this kid, looked at the house, looked at the flames visible through the upstairs windows, and knew with absolute certainty that he had about 2 minutes before the structure became completely untenable, maybe less. "Where's your brother's room?" Marcus was already moving toward the house, pulling off his leather vest and wrapping it around his mouth and nose. It wasn't much protection, but it was better than nothing. Back left corner upstairs. His name is Noah. He's 5. He gets scared, and he hides under his bed when he's scared. Please, he's just a little kid, please. Stay here. Marcus pointed at his bike. Don't move from this spot. I'm bringing your brother out. He didn't wait for a response. He ran. The front door was still open, and Marcus plunged through it into a nightmare of heat and smoke. The entire downstairs was filled with thick gray-black smoke that burned his eyes and throat, even through the makeshift mask of his vest. Visibility was maybe 3 feet. The smoke detector was screaming somewhere above him, a shrill, constant wail that did nothing but confirm what was already obvious. The house was burning, and time was running out. Marcus dropped to a crouch where the air was slightly clearer and oriented himself. He could see the staircase ahead and to the right. Flames were licking up from the lower steps where fire had apparently started in the basement or first floor and was eating its way upward. The stairs themselves weren't fully engulfed yet, but they would be soon. He had one chance to get up and one chance to get back down, and if he miscalculated either one, they'd find his body alongside a 5-year-old's in the wreckage. He took 3 deep breaths of the least smoke-filled air he could find, filling his lungs with whatever oxygen was still available, and then he ran for the stairs. The heat was intense, like standing too close to a bonfire, and he felt it searing through his jeans and work shirt. The first few steps creaked ominously under his weight, but held. He took them 2 at a time, his hand on the railing, his eyes burning and streaming, his lungs already starting to scream for clean air. Halfway up, a section of the railing gave way under his grip, the wood crumbling from heat damage, and he nearly lost his balance. He caught himself against the wall, kept climbing, reached the second-floor landing, and immediately started coughing so hard he thought he might vomit. The upstairs hallway was worse than downstairs. The smoke was thicker, hotter, and the visibility was down to maybe 2 feet. Marcus could feel the floor radiating heat through his boots. Somewhere nearby, probably in the walls, he could hear the fire consuming the structure with a low, roaring crackle that sounded like a living thing. Back left corner, the kid had said. Noah's room. Marcus moved down the hallway in a crouch, one hand on the wall to guide himself, the other held in front of his face, trying to shield his eyes from the worst of the smoke. He passed one doorway, then another, then found what had to be the back left bedroom. The door was closed. He grabbed the handle and immediately jerked his hand back. The metal was hot enough to burn. He wrapped his hand in his vest and tried again, forcing the door open. The bedroom was relatively clear compared to the hallway. Smoke was filtering in under the door and through the vents, but the fire hadn't reached this room yet. Marcus could actually breathe something close to real air for a few precious seconds. The room was small, clearly belonging to a young child. Toy cars scattered across the floor, superhero posters on the walls, a small bed with a Batman comforter. And under that bed, just like his brother had said, was a tiny figure curled into a ball. Noah. Marcus dropped to his knees beside the bed. Noah, I'm here to get you out. Your brother Cameron sent me. We have to go right now. The child didn't respond. Marcus reached under the bed and touched a small shoulder. The boy flinched but didn't move otherwise. He was conscious but frozen with fear, the kind of paralysis that overtook kids when they were too terrified to think or act. Marcus understood. This kid was 5 years old, his house was burning down, he could hear the fire monster eating his home, and now a stranger was telling him to come out from his hiding place. It made perfect sense that he wouldn't move. I know you're scared, buddy, but I promise I'm going to keep you safe. Your brother's outside waiting for you, and he's really worried. We need to go to him right now. Can you do that for me? Can you be brave for your brother? Still nothing. Marcus could feel the heat intensifying, could hear the fire getting closer. He didn't have time for a prolonged negotiation, and he didn't have time to wait for the child to overcome his fear. He reached under the bed, got his hands under Noah's small body, and pulled him out as gently as urgency allowed. The boy started crying immediately, a high-pitched wail of fear, but he didn't fight. Marcus scooped him up, held him against his chest, and moved back toward the door. The hallway was exponentially worse than it had been 30 seconds earlier. The fire had broken through somewhere, and flames were now visible at the far end of the hall, spreading with horrifying speed. The smoke was so thick Marcus couldn't see the staircase. He knew it was there, knew roughly where it should be, but visibility was essentially zero. He wrapped his vest more tightly around Noah's face, pressed the child's head against his shoulder to give him the cleanest air possible, and moved forward by memory and instinct. His boots hit something and he nearly fell. Debris. The ceiling was starting to come down. He stepped over it, kept moving, felt along the wall for the corner that would indicate the top of the stairs. His hand found empty air. The staircase. He looked down, and his heart sank. The lower half of the stairs was now fully engulfed in flames. There was no clear path through. Going down those stairs meant running through fire with a 5-year-old in his arms, and no guarantee the steps would even hold under their combined weight, given how compromised the structure had become. But there was no alternative. The windows in Noah's room had been painted shut years ago, and even if he could break one, jumping from the second story with a child was a last resort he wasn't ready to attempt. The stairs were the only way out, and they were burning. Marcus adjusted his grip on Noah, took one more breath of superheated smoke-filled air that seared his lungs, and went down. The heat was unbelievable. Marcus felt his jeans start to singe, felt his exposed skin blistering, felt Noah screaming against his chest, though he could barely hear it over the roar of the flames. He took the steps as fast as he dared, each footfall a gamble that the wood wouldn't collapse beneath him. Something gave way under his left foot, and his leg plunged through up to his knee. He yanked it free, kept going, stumbled at the bottom, caught himself, and ran for the front door that was somewhere ahead in the smoke. He hit the doorframe with his shoulder, felt fresh air on his face, burst out onto the porch, and kept running until he was 20 feet from the house, before his legs finally gave out and he collapsed onto the gravel driveway with Noah still clutched against his chest. Cameron was there immediately, dropping to his knees beside them, crying and reaching for his little brother. Noah was coughing and sobbing, but alive, his face smudged with soot, but otherwise seemingly unhurt. Marcus rolled onto his back, gasping for air, his lungs feeling like they'd been scoured with steel wool, his exposed skin screaming with pain from minor burns. He could hear sirens in the distance. Someone must have seen the smoke and called it in. Help was coming, but it was going to be too late for the house. The structure was fully involved now, flames visible through every window, the roof starting to sag. Cameron was hugging his brother and crying and saying thank you over and over, and Marcus didn't have enough air in his lungs to respond. He just lay there on the gravel, staring up at the Arizona sky, listening to the distant sirens getting closer, and thought about the split-second decision he'd made to run into a burning building for a child he didn't know, because another child had asked him to. It was the kind of thing that looked insane in retrospect, the kind of thing that could have ended with his own death and accomplished nothing. But Noah was breathing and Cameron was holding him, and that meant it had been worth it. That meant every second of terror and pain and risk had been worth it. The Prescott Fire Department arrived 4 minutes later, 3 trucks screaming up the gravel road with lights blazing and sirens wailing. By then, the Price family home was a total loss, the second story collapsing into the first with a sound like thunder, sending up a massive plume of sparks and ash that rose into the clear September sky. Firefighters immediately went to work containing the blaze and preventing it from spreading to the surrounding pines, but there was no saving the structure itself. It was gone. Paramedics descended on Marcus and the 2 boys with practiced efficiency. Noah was loaded into an ambulance first, oxygen mask over his small face, his vital signs being checked while he clung to a stuffed dinosaur that Cameron had grabbed from the yard. Cameron was examined next, his smoke inhalation deemed moderate but manageable, his biggest injury being psychological trauma from watching his home burn and believing his little brother was going to die inside it. Marcus tried to wave off medical attention, but the EMTs weren't having it. They forced him to sit on the back bumper of the ambulance, gave him oxygen, examined the burns on his arms and neck, and told him in no uncertain terms that he was going to the hospital whether he liked it or not. A Yavapai County Sheriff's deputy approached while the paramedics were wrapping Marcus's forearms in gauze. The officer was a woman in her 40s with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun and the kind of weathered face that came from years of Arizona sun. She introduced herself as Deputy Chen and asked Marcus to explain what had happened. He gave her the condensed version, saw the smoke while riding past, pulled in to check it out, found Cameron outside who told him his brother was trapped upstairs, went in and got the kid out. He kept it factual and brief, leaving out the parts about how terrified he'd been or how many times he'd nearly died in the process. Deputy Chen wrote everything down in a small notebook, her expression unreadable. When Marcus finished, she looked up at him with something that might have been respect or might have been disbelief. He couldn't quite tell which. "Mr. Garrett, what you did was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and I'm not entirely sure which. That building was fully involved. You had no protective equipment, no training in structural firefighting, and no way to know if you'd be able to get yourself out, much less yourself and a child. Marcus shrugged, which hurt more than he expected given the burns. Kid said his brother was inside. Wasn't going to leave him there. The deputy studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. For what it's worth, Noah Price is alive because you made that choice. His parents would have come home from work to find both their sons dead if you hadn't been willing to risk your life for a stranger. She paused. Where are the parents now? Someone asked. Cameron says his mom works at the hospital in Prescott and his dad works construction in Flagstaff. We've contacted both. They're on their way. Marcus was loaded into the ambulance along with Cameron, Noah having already been transported in the first unit. The drive to Yavapai Regional Medical Center took 20 minutes, and Marcus spent most of it watching Cameron, who sat across from him with an oxygen mask on his face and eyes that looked 1,000 years old. The kid had the stunned, hollow expression of someone who'd just survived something that would probably give him nightmares for years. Marcus wanted to say something comforting, something that would help, but he didn't know what words could possibly be adequate for what this boy had just experienced. At the hospital, Marcus was taken to a treatment room where a doctor who looked far too young to have finished medical school examined his burns, treated his smoke inhalation, and informed him that he was lucky he didn't have more serious injuries. The burns were mostly first and second degree, painful but manageable. His lungs had taken a beating from the smoke, but would recover with rest and time. He'd be sore for a week and his voice would sound like gravel for a few days, but he'd be fine. The doctor also told him, with the kind of stern disapproval that only medical professionals could muster, that running into burning buildings was a good way to die, and he should never do it again. Marcus agreed, knowing full well that if he found himself in the same situation tomorrow, he'd make the exact same choice. He was lying in the hospital bed, drifting in and out of consciousness from the pain medication they'd given him, when the door opened and a woman rushed in. She was in her mid-30s, wearing scrubs with a hospital ID badge clipped to her pocket, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her face streaked with tears. She stopped just inside the doorway, looking at Marcus with an expression of overwhelming gratitude and anguish mixed together. "You're the man who saved my son." Her voice broke on the last word. "You're the one who went into my house and brought Noah out." Marcus nodded, his throat too raw to speak comfortably. The woman crossed the room in 3 quick steps and grabbed his hand, holding it between both of hers. Her hands were shaking. "I'm Rebecca Price, Noah and Cameron's mother. The deputy told me what you did. She told me you ran into a burning building for a child you'd never met because my son asked you to." She couldn't continue, overwhelmed by emotion. "Your boys are okay," Marcus managed, his voice hoarse and rough. "Cameron's got some smoke inhalation, but he's going to be fine. Noah's scared, but he's safe. That's what matters." Rebecca Price let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "My house is gone. Everything we owned is gone. But my babies are alive, and that's because of you." She squeezed his hand tighter. "How do I thank someone for that? How do parents thank a stranger for giving them back their children?" "You don't have to thank me," Marcus said quietly. "You just hold those boys tight and help them get through this. That's all the thanks I need." Rebecca stayed for a few more minutes, telling him through tears about how she'd been at work when she got the call, how she'd driven 90 miles an hour down the highway convinced she was going to arrive to find her sons dead, how seeing them alive in the emergency room had broken something open in her chest that she didn't think would ever fully close. Her husband David had already arrived and was with the boys. They wanted to meet Marcus, wanted to thank him in person, but the doctors had sedated Noah to help with his trauma, and Cameron hadn't left his little brother's side. Rebecca promised to bring them by tomorrow before she left, wiping her eyes and telling Marcus one more time that he'd given her family a miracle. The next morning, Marcus was released from the hospital with prescriptions for pain medication and antibiotics for the burns, strict instructions to rest, and a follow-up appointment scheduled for the following week. He was walking out of the hospital entrance when he saw them. The Price family was sitting on a bench outside, clearly waiting. Rebecca and her husband David, a man in his late 30s wearing construction gear, stood up when they saw Marcus. Between them were Cameron and Noah. Cameron looked exhausted but steady. Noah was small and fragile, holding his mother's hand and the stuffed dinosaur simultaneously, his eyes wide and scared, but focused on Marcus with something that looked like awe. David Price approached first, extending his hand. Marcus Garrett. I'm David Price. This is my family that you saved. Thank you doesn't begin to cover what you did for us, but thank you. Marcus shook his hand, feeling the firm grip of a fellow construction worker, someone who understood hard work and risk. Your boys are brave kids. Cameron kept his head in a crisis, and Noah held on when he was scared. They did good. Cameron stepped forward, looking up at Marcus with eyes that were still red-rimmed but determined. I'm sorry I sent you into the fire. I didn't know what else to do. My phone was dead and we don't have a landline anymore, and I just saw you and I thought maybe you could help. But I didn't think about you getting hurt, and I'm sorry. The words came out in a rush, the guilt of a 10-year-old who'd asked an adult to risk his life clear in every syllable. Marcus knelt down, ignoring the protest from his burned legs, and looked Cameron in the eye. You did exactly the right thing. You saw someone who could help and you asked for help. That took courage. Your brother is alive because you made that choice. Don't ever apologize for that. But what if you died? Cameron whispered. What if the fire had killed you and it would have been my fault? Then it would have been the fire's fault, not yours. You didn't start the fire. You didn't make me go inside. I chose to go because your brother needed help and I was in a position to give it. That's what adults do when kids need us. We help, even when it's scary, even when it's dangerous. That's just what we do. Noah, who had been hiding partially behind his mother, peeked out and looked at Marcus with wide eyes. You came and got me from under my bed. His voice was so small it was almost inaudible. The fireman came through the smoke and got me. I wasn't a fireman, buddy. I'm just a regular guy who happened to be riding past your house. But yeah, I came and got you because your big brother asked me to, and big brothers know when their little brothers need help. Noah considered this for a moment, then stepped forward and wrapped his small arms around Marcus's neck in a hug that was fierce despite his size. Thank you for coming to get me. I was really scared. I know you were. You were really brave. Marcus hugged him back carefully, mindful of his burns, and felt something crack open in his own chest. This tiny child who'd been hiding under his bed in terror, who'd survived because Marcus had made an insane split-second decision, was alive and safe and hugging him. It made every second of pain worth it. The Price family invited Marcus to stay in touch. They'd lost their home, but David's parents had a large property outside Prescott where they could stay while they rebuilt. Rebecca gave Marcus her phone number and email address and made him promise to let them know how he was recovering. Cameron asked if he could visit Marcus sometime, said he wanted to learn about motorcycles and construction because those seemed like important skills for someone who wanted to help people. Noah just held Marcus's hand and looked at him like he was some kind of superhero, which made Marcus deeply uncomfortable and strangely honored at the same time. Over the following months, Marcus kept in touch with the Price family. He helped David with some of the rebuild work on their new home, using his construction expertise to guide the project and even donating materials through connections he had in the industry. The Desert Kings Motorcycle Club heard about what Marcus had done and organized a fundraiser for the family, raising enough money to help cover the costs that insurance didn't. Cameron visited the clubhouse several times, fascinated by the bikes and the brotherhood, asking endless questions about motorcycles and rescue techniques and what it meant to be part of a club. Noah slowly came out of his shell, his nightmares decreasing in frequency as therapy helped him process the trauma. 1 year after the fire, on a Saturday afternoon in September, the Desert Kings held their annual charity ride to raise money for local fire departments. Marcus was riding point, leading a pack of 40 motorcycles through the winding roads outside Prescott when they stopped at the Price family's new home for a scheduled break. The house was beautiful, built to modern fire codes with multiple exits and state-of-the-art smoke detection systems. David and Rebecca had done everything possible to ensure their family would never be trapped like that again. The family was waiting outside when the motorcycles arrived. Noah, now 6 years old and significantly more confident, ran up to Marcus with a drawing he'd made. It showed a stick figure on a motorcycle riding toward a house with flames and another stick figure carrying a smaller stick figure out to safety. The words written in crayon at the bottom said, "Thank you for saving me, Mr. Marcus." Cameron, now 11, showed Marcus the first aid certification he'd earned through a youth program. He decided he wanted to be a paramedic when he grew up, wanted to be someone who helped people in emergencies the way Marcus had helped his brother. Marcus stood in that yard, surrounded by his club brothers, looking at this family that had been shattered by fire and put back together through community support and resilience, and felt something he hadn't expected: purpose. For years he'd ridden with the Desert Kings, had done the charity work and the community outreach, had tried to live by the club's code of helping those who needed it, but it had always felt somewhat abstract. On that September afternoon, when Cameron had grabbed his arm and said those 4 words, everything had become crystalline clear. This was why the club existed. This was why they wore patches that said they'd protect the vulnerable. This was why brotherhood mattered. Because sometimes a kid needed someone to run into a burning building, and if you had the courage and the will and the love for strangers, you could be that person. The Desert Kings added a new patch to their collection after that day. A small flame with a child's silhouette inside it and the words "when seconds count" underneath. They gave one to every member as a reminder of what Marcus had done, of what any of them should be willing to do if called upon. It wasn't about seeking glory or recognition. It was about being the kind of people who ran toward danger when someone needed help, who listened when a terrified child asked for assistance, who understood that heroism wasn't about being fearless, but about being so committed to protecting others that fear became secondary to action. Cameron Price grew up knowing that his voice mattered, that when he'd asked a stranger for help in the worst moment of his life, that stranger had answered without hesitation. He carried that knowledge into adolescence and adulthood, becoming someone who paid attention to people in distress, who trusted his instincts when something seemed wrong, who was willing to act when others might look away. Noah grew up knowing that sometimes heroes looked like scary bikers with leather vests and loud motorcycles, that appearances could be deceiving, and that the people who seemed most intimidating were sometimes the ones most willing to sacrifice everything to keep children safe. And Marcus Garrett rode on year after year, carrying in his heart the memory of a 10-year-old boy who'd grabbed his arm and trusted him with his brother's life. He never talked about what he'd done as if it were extraordinary. To him, it was simply what any decent person would have done in that situation. But Cameron and Noah and their parents knew differently. They knew that running into a burning building for a stranger's child was rare and beautiful, and proof that humanity at its best showed up when it mattered most. The story became part of Desert King's lore, told around campfires and at club meetings, not to glorify Marcus, but to remind every member that their commitment to protecting the vulnerable wasn't theoretical. It was real and immediate, and sometimes it required running into fire. If this story reminded you to pay attention when something seems wrong, to trust children when they ask for help, and to understand that sometimes the most important thing you can do is act immediately when seconds count, then carry that awareness forward. Because somewhere right now, a child might need someone to believe them, to help them, to run toward danger instead of away from it. And the difference between tragedy and survival might be one person willing to make the choice Marcus made, to risk everything because a scared kid asked for help and no other answer was acceptable. Tell yourself that if you ever find yourself in that position, you'll be the person who acts, who runs toward the problem, who refuses to let fear or caution prevent you from doing what's right. Because that's what heroes do. They show up when it matters. They listen when children speak. They run into fire when someone needs saving. And they never ask for thanks, because seeing a child safe and alive and hugging their family is all the reward they'll ever need.